Snow swept down from the hills of Montana in slow, stubborn swirls, softening the edges of fences and blanketing the Whispering Pines Rescue Ranch in a hushed, frozen stillness. The stables stood quiet, wood creaking under the weight of old stories and heavier winters. In the furthest stall, half in shadow, half caught in the brittle morning light, a black stallion towered. His coat glimmered like oil on water, every muscle wound tight, as if ready to snap or bolt. But what caught the eye first, always, was his front left leg, replaced by a matte, sturdy prosthetic, fitted with more care than pride. A tarnished plaque on the stall door read, "Ash, caution, no male handlers." Someone had etched a second, deeper line underneath, one that time hadn't yet erased. No one talked about it. The horse didn't either. Mary Ann stood just outside the stall, snow melting into her boots, breath fogging the air. At 32, her face showed lines that belonged to older women, shadows under her eyes from too many nights awake, and a mouth set in a line that almost never curved upward these days. The staff called her the therapist, as if that word could patch the holes left by grief. She barely heard them. She'd come to the ranch because she didn't know where else to go. Sadie, her daughter, pressed close to her side. Small fingers twined around Mary Ann's cold hand. 9 years old, Sadie hadn't spoken above a whisper since the funeral. She'd shrunk into herself, the way some kids do when the world gets too loud and the only safe place is somewhere far inside. They stopped in front of Ash's stall. For a while, nobody said anything. Mary Ann felt the ache in her chest expand, pushing against her ribs. She didn't believe in omens. Not really, but there was something in the air. A static charge, maybe? Or just the cold. Sadie broke the silence, voice barely a thread. He's standing, like he's waiting on something that never came. Ash didn't turn his head, didn't stomp or snort, just one ear flicked, slow and deliberate, as if measuring the weight of her words. He shifted his balance, metal hoof thudding softly against old straw. Around them, the other horses stilled, as if some secret signal had swept through the barn. The whole stable seemed to hold its breath. A ranch hand lingered at the far end of the aisle, pretending to stack hay, but really just watching. "He doesn't like men," she warned, her voice just loud enough to echo. "Kicked out at every handler they tried." "That leg's from an old injury. No one really knows how it happened. But he's not safe. Some say he's unfixable." Mary Ann didn't flinch. She'd heard those words before, too many times, in different rooms with different faces. Unfixable, broken, dangerous. She kept her gaze on Ash, trying to see past the scarred hide, past the ruined leg, into something deeper, a place she'd spent too much time herself. She knelt to Sadie's level, searching for a sign, a flicker in her daughter's eyes. "Would you like to meet him?" she asked quietly. Sadie nodded, still not looking away from the horse. Mary Ann reached for the latch. "Easy," she murmured, more to herself than to Ash. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the memory of what it meant to open a door you weren't sure you could close again. Ash's ears flattened, nostrils flaring, but he didn't move. He just watched, eyes sharp and waiting. Mary Ann stepped inside, slow and unthreatening. She stood beside the massive animal, feeling the heat radiating from his body, watching the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. Controlled, deliberate. A lesson in patience and survival. Sadie hovered in the doorway. She slid an apple from her pocket and set it on the straw, backing away like she was leaving an offering at a sacred altar. Ash's eyes flicked to the apple, then back to the girl. He didn't take it. Not yet. "Some animals," Mary Ann said softly, "wait to see if you mean what you offer." Sadie nodded, silent. A wind rattled the barn doors, snow swirling into fine powder. Mary Ann stood in the quiet with her daughter. The three of them, woman, child, wounded stallion, held together by invisible threads of loss and hope. From somewhere deep in the ranch, a bell clanged, signaling the end of visiting hours. Other families drifted out, voices rising in laughter, boots crunching on fresh snow. Mary Ann and Sadie lingered, unwilling to break the spell. Finally, Sadie whispered, "Can we stay a little longer?" Mary Ann squeezed her hand. letting the answer hang between them. For the first time in weeks, her heart didn't feel so heavy. Ash flicked his ear again, the smallest sign of acknowledgement, and for a single moment, just a heartbeat, the cold barn felt like a place where something new could begin. The next morning dawned pale and gray, clouds heavy with more snow. Whispering Pines Rescue Ranch felt emptier than ever, the long barn stretching out into silence. And inside the small staff kitchen, Marianne sat at a scarred wooden table, clutching a styrofoam cup of bad coffee, her mind whirling with images of Ash's unreadable eyes and Sadie's quiet fascination. Across from her, Ruth, the ranch manager, tapped a pen against a clipboard, studying the forms that would determine the stallion's fate. "You really want to take him?" Ruth's tone was gentle but skeptical, like a doctor breaking bad news. He's not like the others. We've had trainers from Billings, from as far as Missoula. None could do a thing with him, and well, you saw the warning. The only reason he's still here is that nobody's quite sure what else to do." Marianne kept her voice steady, though her stomach tightened. "I don't want to pressure him. I just want to try, on my own terms, if he's going to have any chance at all. It needs to be slow, gentle. No more men, no loud voices, no ropes, no rush." Ruth pursed her lips. "That's not protocol." Marianne shrugged, forcing a tired smile. "Neither is keeping a horse alive this long when he's considered unadoptable. Let me sign the forms. Give us 10 days. I'll take all liability. No one else will handle him." The room fell silent. Finally, Ruth slid the stack of papers across the table, her eyes searching Marianne's face for any sign of doubt. There was none. Marianne signed her name in quick, confident strokes. Her signature had always been neater before the accident. She didn't dwell on that now. Later, with the paperwork handled, the staff gathered outside Ash's stall. They kept their distance, as if the shadows inside might leap out and bite. Marianne stepped forward alone, moving slow, her hands empty, her presence calm. She spoke softly, telling Ash what was about to happen, even though she knew he couldn't understand the words, at least not in the way people expected. The ranch hand slid open the stall door. Ash shifted, muscles rippling, prosthetic leg clicking as he tested the edge of the new world. For a moment, Marianne thought he might refuse to move, but then Sadie, standing near the fence line, held up a single red apple. Ash took a step. Then another. Marianne watched every motion, her breath caught tight in her chest. He let himself be led, no halter, no rope, across the icy yard and into the waiting trailer. Only when the ramp closed did Marianne allow herself to exhale. Their own ranch sat on the far side of the county, smaller and rougher than the rescue facility. The main paddock was little more than a fenced field, patched with frostbitten grass and clumps of snow, with a small weathered barn that leaned just a little to the west. Marianne and Sadie worked together to prepare Ash's new space. Marianne fixed the gate herself, tightening hinges, sanding splinters smooth. Sadie scattered old woolen blankets over the straw to make it softer, more inviting, just in case comfort could tempt a wounded horse to trust again. When they opened the trailer, Ash hesitated at the edge, nostrils flaring. He looked not at Marianne, but at Sadie, who stood to the side, quiet and still, a steady anchor in the uncertain morning. After a moment, Ash stepped down, his prosthetic sinking into the snow. He moved with wary precision, every motion measured, as if expecting some new hurt at every turn. Marianne watched as Ash surveyed the paddock. He circled the fence once, testing its limits, then stood motionless by the far corner, head low. Hours passed. He didn't eat when the Yoel were nearby, didn't drink until the sun had dipped below the trees. He refused to lie down at all. Muscles taut as piano wire, hooves rooted as if he feared the earth itself might betray him. Sadie, watching from the porch, clutched a blanket tight around her shoulders. She made a habit quickly of leaving small gifts for Ash at dusk. Apples, carrots, a sugar cube nestled in her mitten. She never approached too close, never tried to touch him, only placed the offerings by the fence and retreated to the porch to wait. Night after night, Ash ignored the gifts until Sadie had gone inside. Then, slowly, warily, he would stretch his neck through the fence, nostrils twitching as he accepted what was offered. Each morning the apples were gone, the only proof of a connection built one cautious moment at a time. Marianne kept a journal in those days, recording every small shift. When Ash sniffed the hay pile instead of ignoring it, when he let her stand close, without pinning his ears. She wrote down Sadie's whispered observations, too, her daughter's gentle insights weaving a tapestry of hope between the lines. Still, progress was glacial. The neighbors whispered, convinced Ash would never be normal, that Marianne's experiment would end in heartbreak. Even the local vet, after his first visit, shook his head and muttered, "You're trying to fix something that's already lost." But Marianne believed in things unseen. She believed in what could grow from patience, from quiet, from kindness that asked nothing in return. One evening, as the sky bruised with twilight, Marianne saw Sadie standing at the paddock fence, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Ash stood on the far side, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. Marianne wrapped her arms around her daughter, and together they watched as the stallion slowly, deliberately took a single step closer, and then another. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that hope, for the first time, felt less like a burden and more like a possibility. Inside the house that night, as wind rattled the windows and snow began to fall again, Sadie whispered into her pillow, "He's not gone. He's just waiting for the right reason to come back." Marianne, listening from the doorway, let herself believe it too. Underscore, 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 underscore. Winter deepened around the ranch, its silence stretching out like a second skin. The snow in Montana seemed endless, blanketing hills and pasture, muffling every sound except the crunch of footsteps and the far-off call of a hawk. Nights came early. The moon would cast blue shadows through icy window panes, pooling on the floor of Sadie's room and drawing pale lines across the paddock where Ash stood, always standing as if guarding the boundary between what was safe and what was lost. For 4 days, the routine stayed unchanged. Sadie left apples at the fence. Marianne logged each careful sign of progress, and Ash hovered at the edge of everything, present but distant, like a storm that might roll in or blow away. He wouldn't eat while anyone watched. He wouldn't rest. Some nights, Marianne saw him outlined against the snow, head up, eyes open, nostrils flaring at every shift of wind. A sentry or a prisoner, she couldn't tell which. Sadie's voice, too, was a rare thing. She spoke mostly in gestures, setting her boots quietly by the door, lining up her gloves, brushing the snow from Ash's water trough in careful circles. Marianne watched her daughter and the horse, both moving through their days like echoes of one another, hesitant, patient, battered by things they didn't say aloud. On the 5th night, as the sky flickered with the faint promise of northern lights, a different kind of sound crept into the house. Sadie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. When she heard it, a metallic clink, steady and deliberate, as if someone was tapping a rhythm only they could understand. She slipped from beneath her covers, shivering, and pressed her face to the cold window pane. Down in the darkness, illuminated by the porch light's thin halo, Ash stood by the gate. His prosthetic leg glinted, and every few seconds he tapped it against the metal bar. Clink, pause, clink, pause. Never frantic, always measured as though he was waiting for an answer. "Mom." Sadie's whisper barely broke the hush of the house. Marianne, who had learned to sleep light since becoming a widow, was already awake, standing in the hallway. She'd heard it too. She wrapped Sadie in a thick robe, her hands trembling, and together they moved through the house, every board creaking, every step filled with uncertainty and hope. Outside, the cold hit them like a wave. Marianne gripped the flashlight with white-knuckled hands, her breath curling in the frozen air. She hesitated only a moment at the back door, then slipped through, Sadie close at her side. Ash waited. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He simply watched, eyes reflecting the thin beam of Marianne's light. She moved to the gate, her body language open, slow, refusing to bring any of her own tension into the circle between them. "I'm going to open it," Marianne said, softly. She wasn't sure if she meant it for Sadie or for the horse, but either way, she followed through. The latch clicked, the gate creaked, and for a heartbeat, everything was still. Ash stepped forward, out of his paddock for the first time. He didn't race away or charge. He didn't even sniff the ground. He just limped a few feet into the open, stopped, and turned his face to the sky. The stars seemed brighter then, cold fires scattered across endless black. Sadie, barefoot in her slippers, stepped closer than she'd ever dared. She hummed, barely more than a breath, the melody from an old lullaby Marianne had sung years ago, back before the accident, before the silence, in the morning. The tune floated out into the cold night, fragile and brave at once. Ash flicked his ear, then lowered his massive head. Marianne's heart thudded as Sadie reached up, a tiny hand stretching toward the black mane. She stroked it, gently, tentatively, while her voice quivered in the air. Ash didn't pull away. He didn't freeze. He exhaled, slow and deep, and for the first time, his posture softened, the lines of his body easing into surrender rather than defense. They stood like that for a long moment. Child, horse, mother, joined by music and midnight air. The whole world seemed to pause with them. Then, with surprising grace, Ash nuzzled closer, letting Sadie's hand linger. Marianne wiped her eyes, tears hot against the icy wind. When they finally guided him back toward the barn, Ash walked at Sadie's side, never rushing, never lagging behind. He paused at his stall, waiting for the door to open. Marianne gave him space, letting Sadie lead him in. That night, she watched as he finished, every last bit of his feed, grain and apples disappearing, as if he'd always known he was safe. But it just needed proof. Inside the house, Marianne sat by the window, journal in hand, scribbling notes with shaking fingers. "He came when called," she wrote, "not out of obedience, but trust. Sadie's song is his answer. For the first time, he ate in front of us. For the first time, he rested." As the night deepened, the house filled with a peace Marianne had not felt in months. Sadie curled beneath her blankets, lips moving with the words of the lullaby, a faint smile touching her cheeks. Outside, Ash lay in the straw, legs tucked beneath him, breathing slow and deep. For the first time since his arrival, he closed his eyes, surrendering to sleep. The silence had broken, not with words, but with music and patience, and the courage to wait for what might never come. And in that fragile, hopeful stillness, something new took root. The days stretched longer, the pale Montana sun slowly rising higher, throwing icy shards of light across the quiet ranch. The snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of the property, but here and there the ground softened, promising the possibility of spring. In this slow thaw, the routines of the small family and their wounded stallion settled into something almost comfortable. Almost because comfort was always fragile when built atop so much loss. Ash had become an undeniable presence on the ranch. He didn't follow Marianne or Sadie like a pet, nor did he accept their affection easily. His boundaries were clear, close, but never crowded, always maintaining his own sense of dignity and distance. Yet, every day, he seemed to let down his guard a little more. He'd graze near Sadie when she sat on the porch, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sun. He'd let Marianne brush his mane, if she moved slowly and spoke in her low, even voice. Most nights, Ash would finish his feed, toss his head once in silent acknowledgement, and settle down within sight of the house, a silent guardian in the drifting snow. It was on one of these late afternoons that the peace was shattered. Marianne had been sorting through old boxes in the barn, searching for the heavy quilts she'd stored away for emergencies. Sadie, bundled up in her thick red coat, sat cross-legged on the porch, tracing shapes in the frost with a stick. The sun dipped toward the horizon, setting the sky ablaze in streaks of pink and orange, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel cut through the silence. A delivery van, a battered blue Ford with the logo half worn off, lurched into the driveway. So the driver, young and hurried, hopped out, a large cardboard box in his arms. He barely glanced at the house, Instead, he strode right up to the porch and with a sharp bang, dropped the box onto the wooden boards. Sadie flinched so hard she nearly toppled backward, her stick falling from her hand. The sudden noise reverberated through the cold air, too loud, too close. Her breath caught in her throat, eyes wide with panic, the old fear flooding back. Ash, who had been grazing at the far end of the yard, jerked his head up. For a split second he stood frozen, ears flat, tail rigid. Then, moving faster than anyone could have expected, he started towards the house. Each stride was heavy and awkward, the prosthetic leg thudding against frozen ground, but his intent was unmistakable. He cut a direct line between Sadie and the delivery man, placing his massive body squarely between them. The delivery driver stopped short, eyes going wide as the black stallion advanced. Ash didn't rear, he didn't snarl or lash out. Instead, he planted his hooves firmly, prosthetic legs set forward, and fixed the man with a steady, unblinking stare. Every muscle in his frame was coiled, ready, not with aggression, but with a clear, silent warning. This is as close as you get. Marianne, hearing the commotion, raced from the barn, her heart hammering. She saw Ash, saw Sadie's pale face, and the young man frozen at the bottom of the porch steps. For a moment, no one moved. The driver cleared his throat, trying for bravado, but his voice shook. Package for, M. Harris? He tried to sidestep around Ash, but the stallion shifted, blocking him with his broad chest. The prosthetic leg clanked with each shift of weight, the sound oddly menacing in the quiet evening. Sadie, breathing fast, pressed herself against the porch rail. Marianne called to her, voice soft but firm. "It's okay, honey. I'm here." Then she approached Ash, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "Ash," she murmured, feeling the tension beneath his coat. "It's all right. He's leaving now." Ash's ear flicked at her voice. Slowly he relaxed, his body no longer rigid. He didn't step aside, but his posture softened, making it clear to the driver that as long as he kept his distance, there would be no trouble. The driver, visibly shaken, set the package down with exaggerated care, backing away. "Never seen a horse do that," he muttered, glancing at Marianne. He's different." "Yeah," Marianne replied, her voice warm with gratitude and awe. "He is." When the van rattled out of the drive, Marianne finally coaxed Ash away from the porch, guiding him gently back to the paddock. Sadie, still shaking, slid off the porch and hurried to her mother's side, wrapping her arms around Marianne's waist. They watched as Ash, now calm, returned to his corner of the fence, scanning the horizon for threats only he could see. Marianne knelt beside her daughter, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You know," she said softly, "some people say animals avoid pain. But Ash is trying to shield it. He's not just looking out for himself anymore. He's looking out for us." Sadie nodded, still too shaken to speak, but her small hand found her mother's, squeezing tightly. That night, as the house settled into its quiet rhythms, Marianne replayed the incident over and over in her mind. She wrote in her journal, trying to capture the feeling. And Ash stood between Sadie and the world, not because he was angry or scared, but because he saw her fear and took it as his own. He became her shield. Later, when Sadie was tucked safely into bed, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Ash." As if she knew the stallion was listening just outside her window. Outside, Ash stood beneath the stars, silent and proud. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to someone, and that someone belonged to him. The night air was sharp, filled with the distant sound of coyotes and the crackle of frozen branches. Yet, in the warmth of that small house, surrounded by the love and courage that had taken root in wounded hearts, it felt, for a moment, like the safest place in the world. The days that followed Ash's silent act of protection blended together in a slow, gentle thaw. Montana's snow still crept along the fence lines and pooled in icy corners, but the air inside the house felt a little warmer. There was a new steadiness in Sadie's step as she followed her mother through morning chores, and a softer quality to Marianne's voice, as if some old fear had finally eased its grip on their lives. But the nights remained long and restless. It was past midnight when the nightmare struck. A night so cold the windows crackled with frost, and the wind clawed at the house, searching for cracks. Marianne was jolted awake by a sound she hadn't heard in years. Sadie's scream, sharp and raw, slicing through the quiet as if tearing open an old wound. She ran to her daughter's room, her heart thudding, dread flooding her chest. Sadie sat bolt upright in bed, tangled in sheets, her face slick with sweat, sobbing in huge, silent gulps. She couldn't find her voice, only managed to clutch at Marianne's arm with desperate, trembling hands. "It's okay, baby. I'm here," Marianne whispered, rocking her gently, running a soothing hand through her hair. "You're safe?" "You're safe." But the terror would not leave Sadie's eyes, no matter how tightly Marianne held her. Outside, the wind battered the windows harder, shrieking around corners, rattling the thin panes in their frames. It was as if the world itself had turned against their small, fragile home. Then, from outside, came a new sound. Not the wind, not the coyotes. Something slower, more deliberate, a heavy step on frozen ground, a scrape, then a thud, again, then again, closer to the house. Sadie stiffened in Marianne's arms. "Ash," she whispered, voice ragged, but now filled with a wild hope. Marianne went to the window, brushing aside the curtain with a shaking hand. There, bathed in the silver blue of the porch light and the endless swirl of snow, stood Ash. He was closer to the house than he had ever dared before, close enough that his breath fogged the glass, close enough that Marianne could see the trembling in his flank, the frost clinging to his mane, the deep steadiness of his eyes. He lowered his head, pressing his broad, scarred face to the window pane. He didn't move, didn't paw or snort. He simply stayed, anchoring himself and the house together against the storm. Marianne called softly to Sadie, who shuffled across the cold floor, blanket around her shoulders, and pressed her palm to the glass where Ash's muzzle rested. For a moment, all three, mother, daughter, horse, remained still, joined by the thin barrier of glass and the thick, silent understanding that lived between survivors. "I dreamed I was in the fire again," Sadie whispered. But Ash was there too. He pulled me out." Marianne felt her eyes sting. She squeezed Sadie's hand, then pulled her close, letting the child's breath steady against her chest. Outside, Ash continued to stand guard. The storm raged, but he never flinched. For over an hour, he remained there, head bowed, offering only his silent, unwavering presence. It was enough. Sadie's breathing slowed, her trembling stopped. The nightmare retreated, not because it was vanquished, but because Ash refused to let it win. When the wind finally began to die, Marianne guided Sadie back to bed. She watched through the window as Ash turned, heavy and slow, and returned to his paddock. He glanced back once, as if making sure they were safe, then settled by the fence, a hulking shadow against the dying storm. The next morning dawned with brittle sunlight and the hush that only follows the worst of storms. Sadie woke with a new resolve, one Marianne saw instantly in the straightness of her daughter's back, the way she moved through breakfast without needing to be coaxed. As there was still a pallor to her face, a heaviness in her eyes, but something had shifted. After breakfast, Sadie bundled up and marched outside, her boots crunching over fresh snow. Ash stood by the fence, nostrils steaming in the cold. For the first time, Sadie didn't hesitate. She went right to him, reaching up to stroke his neck. He lowered his head, letting her hand rest there for a long, peaceful moment. "I'm going to call you Ash," she said, voice clear, carrying across the field. "Because sometimes fire leaves behind something quiet and strong." Marianne watched from the porch, heart swelling, her own breath catching. The name felt right, like an answer to an unspoken question. Ash flicked an ear, almost as if acknowledging the honor. From that day on, Ash changed. He began nudging open the stall with his broad forehead, pushing through to follow Sadie as she moved about the property. He was never too close, always a few steps behind, never crowding, but never letting her out of his sight either. If Sadie climbed the fence to watch the hills or sat in the grass to read, Ash would stand just far enough away to give her space, but near enough to catch every movement, every sigh. Other small shifts followed. At dusk, he would come to the porch and wait until Sadie said goodnight. When strangers passed the property on the main road, Ash would plant himself in their line of sight, making his size and purpose clear. Yet the biggest change was in Sadie. The girl who once shrank from every sound now spoke up when she needed something. She laughed, softly at first, then with growing confidence, as Ash performed his clumsy, almost comedic attempts at play, pawing at a stray bucket, chasing crows away from the feed shed, pretending not to care when Marianne caught him rolling in the snow. At night, Marianne sometimes found herself standing by Sadie's door, listening to her daughter's even breathing. She'd slip outside, mug of tea in hand, and sit on the steps. Ash would be there too, standing watch, breathing steam into the frigid air. Sometimes, Marianne would talk to him. About nothing. About everything. And though he never answered, she always felt better for having spoken. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Sadie climbed up on the porch beside her mother. She leaned against Marianne's shoulder, eyes fixed on the dark shape of Ash. "I think he saved me, Mom," she said, voice quiet but sure. Marianne smiled through her tears. "Maybe he saved all of us, honey. Maybe he's the piece of the fire that didn't go out." Right. And so, in the gentle hush of the Montana twilight, they sat, 3 survivors, bound not by words, but by the silent courage to stay. Montana's weather is a creature of moods, sometimes gentle and forgiving, sometimes harsh and wild, testing the limits of anyone who dares call it home. The winter storm arrived without mercy. By dusk, clouds pressed low over the hills, swallowing the horizon, the wind shrieking through pine and fence post, hurling stinging sheets of snow that erased every path. The ranch hunkered down beneath the assault, its edges vanishing beneath drifts that grew deeper with every hour. Inside the little house, the air felt brittle. Marianne spent the afternoon preparing, moving through her routine with the calm determination of someone who knows fear by name. She checked the generator, packed extra food for Ash in the barn, stacked wood near the stove, and filled every kettle and jug in the kitchen with water, just in case the pipes froze. Sadie followed close behind, clutching her favorite patchwork blanket, eyes wide and solemn as she watched her mother. "We'll be fine," Marianne said, forcing a reassuring smile as she stuffed towels along the baseboards to keep out the draft. We've been through worse." But as evening fell, the wind howled harder, and the house creaked in protest. The lights flickered, then failed. The living room glowed only by the uncertain light of a kerosene lantern, shadows dancing along the walls like memories. In the barn, the horses shuffled anxiously, their whinnies muffled by snow-packed walls. Marianne checked on Ash one last time before dark, finding him in his paddock, already flecked with white, mane stiff with ice. "Ash, come on, boy. Shelter," she called, holding the stall door wide, but he refused to budge. Instead, he stood statue still just outside the barn, gaze fixed on the house, as if counting the windows, as if memorizing the shape of home. Back inside, Marianne wrapped Sadie in layers of sweaters and blankets, piling their sleeping bags together in the living room near the wood stove. They ate dinner from a can, laughing at how the beans stuck to their spoons, making jokes to keep the shadows at bay. Every now and then, the wind gusted, rattling the windows so fiercely that Marianne feared the glass might shatter. With the power gone and night settling in, the temperature began to drop. She stoked the stove, coaxed its orange glow as high as it would go, and bundled Sadie tighter, rubbing her cold hands. Outside, the storm screamed. Ash remained where he was, a dark silhouette just visible through the snow swirling past the porch light. He didn't pace or stamp, just stood in the lee of the house, unwavering. Marianne checked the thermometer. Inside, it read barely 50 degrees. She knew it would be colder still outside, the kind of cold that crept into bones and never let go. Sometime past midnight, Sadie stirred restlessly. "Mom, I'm cold." Her teeth chattered despite all the blankets. Marianne hugged her closer, heart aching. She felt the limits of her strength closing in, the boundaries between protector and powerless mother fraying in the storm. Then a thud sounded near the front steps. Marianne sat up, alert. Through the frosted glass, she could just make out Ash, still standing. His coat was crusted with snow, head bowed, tail whipping in the wind. He'd left the safety of the barn. He stood just outside their door, as if holding back the elements by sheer force of will. Sadie pressed her face to the glass. "He's not moving," she whispered. "He's keeping watch," Marianne murmured, trying to believe it for both their sakes. Minutes passed. Ash never flinched, never turned away, his presence a silent bulwark against the storm's fury. Inside, the stove hissed, barely holding off the chill. The wind rattled the walls, finding every crack. Marianne shivered, realizing that for the first time in years, she was afraid not just for herself, but for someone else, for the fragile life she'd built, for the little girl she'd nearly lost, for the wounded horse who refused to abandon them. As the hour dragged on, Sadie couldn't sleep. "Can we let him in?" she asked. "He's freezing." Marianne shook her head, pained. "He wouldn't come inside, baby. He needs to choose for himself." The storm finally began to ease toward dawn. The snow, once a horizontal blur, fell soft and vertical, painting the world in shades of blue and silver. Marianne, bleary-eyed, dragged herself up to check on Ash. She opened the door, boots crunching in thigh-deep drifts, breath billowing in clouds. Ash was still there, but now, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, he had lain down, right on the frozen earth, near the porch, his body curled against the wind. He'd never let his guard down, never allowed his body to rest before, always sleeping upright, ready to flee. But now, exhaustion and trust won out over fear. His eyes closed, breath slow and even, snow heaped along his back and flanks. Marianne knelt beside him, resting a hand gently on his mane. He didn't stir. Sadie knelt too, careful and quiet, pressing her hand to his neck, feeling the steady, reassuring thump of his heart beneath ice-cold skin. "He stayed for us," Sadie whispered. Marianne nodded, unable to speak. As the first sunlight crept across the drifts, the little family, horse, mother, daughter, sat together in the new silence. It was a silence not of absence, but of survival, of gratitude, of bonds forged in storm and stillness. For the first time, Ash allowed himself to belong, not just to the land, but to the people who had braved the winter with him. They dozed together, curled beneath old blankets, their breaths mingling in the frozen air, while the storm melted into memory. For one rare, perfect morning, they were not broken, not lost, not haunted. They were simply together, and that was enough. Montana's winter had a way of lingering even as the calendar insisted it was spring. The drifts slowly receded, revealing patches of brown grass and soggy earth beneath. But the air was sharp, and the sky still brooded, heavy with the memory of storms. At the ranch, routines had settled into a quiet rhythm. Sadie walked with Ash along the fence line each morning, his steps still uneven but more sure with every day, his presence as constant as the slow return of light. It was during one of these gentle mornings that the peace shattered, not with the violence of wind or the chill of night, but with the shrill, urgent ring of the telephone. Marianne answered, her voice still thick with sleep. On the other end, a neighbor spoke in clipped, frightened tones. A girl from the nearby elementary school had gone missing during a class campout in the woods that bordered their land. The search teams are out," the woman said, her voice tight. "They've been at it since dawn. If you see anything, anyone, you'll let us know." Marianne promised she would. She hung up feeling the old familiar ache of helplessness press against her ribs. She glanced out the window to where Sadie and Ash moved slowly along the fence. In her daughter's hand was a bright blue scarf, trailing through the mud, her laughter mixing with Ash's low, contented snorts. She didn't mention the call at first. She didn't want to alarm Sadie. But the news swept through the valley with frightening speed. Neighbors drove by on snow-caked ATVs, calling out the missing girl's name. Dogs barked, their voices echoing through the pines. Helicopters thudded overhead, searching the maze of trees and ravines that twisted through the foothills. By afternoon, The searchers had found nothing. They gathered at the edge of the woods, faces lined with worry, voices growing hoarse with fear. Marianne watched them from the porch, a mug of cold coffee trembling in her hands. She recognized the looks on their faces, the look of people who had begun to imagine the worst. Sadie sensed the tension before her mother said a word. She drifted into the kitchen, eyes wide and quiet. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked. Marianne hesitated, then knelt to her daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair behind Sadie's ear. "There's a girl missing in the woods," she said softly. "Everyone is looking for her. I don't want you to be scared." Sadie's eyes filled with worry. She glanced toward the window, where Ash stood in the paddock, watching them both. That night, the worry seeped into everything. Marianne tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Sadie, usually soothed by Ash's nearness, was restless too. In the early hours, long before dawn, she woke from a troubled dream, her face pale and her small hands trembling. "I saw her, Mom," Sadie whispered, voice catching. "I saw the lost girl. She was under a tree, and she was so cold." Marianne wrapped her arms around Sadie, shushing her gently, but her daughter clung tight, urgency in her grip. "Ash saw her too," Sadie insisted. "In my dream. He showed me where she was. We have to go. Please, Mom. Please." Marianne's heart twisted. She wanted to reassure Sadie, to chalk it up to nightmares and nerves, but something in her daughter's face, some raw certainty, unsettled her. By dawn, Marianne made up her mind. She bundled Sadie in her warmest coat, laced up her own boots, and led her out to the paddock. Ash waited at the gate, eyes shining in the cold, brittle light. As soon as Marianne unlatched the gate, Ash nudged Sadie's shoulder gently, then turned, heading straight for the trail that led toward the hills. The woods were colder than Marianne remembered, the trees looming tall and silent, every branch heavy with frost. Ash limped ahead, but with a determination that surprised them both. His hooves broke through thin crusts of snow, his breath puffing in silver clouds. He paused often, sniffing the air, ears twitching towards every faint sound. Which way, Ash?" Sadie called, her voice trembling. The horse angled left, pushing through a thicket of pine. Marianne followed, heart thundering in her chest, each step a battle between hope and dread. After nearly an hour, Ash stopped beside a shallow ravine. He pawed at the frozen earth, snorting, eyes fixed on something in the shadows. Sadie slid down the slope, Marianne close behind. There, under a tangle of branches, lay a small shape, still and silent, curled tightly against the cold. Marianne's breath caught. For a moment she feared the worst, but then the girl stirred, lifting her head with a weak, shivering cry. "It's okay," Marianne called, rushing forward. She wrapped the child in her coat, pulling her close, pressing her face to the girl's icy forehead. "You're safe now, honey. You're safe." Ash lowered his body, positioning himself between the girl and the biting wind. He lay so close that his warmth radiated through the layers of snow and branches. Sadie crouched beside him, stroking his mane, whispering words of comfort she didn't even know she remembered. Minutes later, the sounds of the search party echoed through the trees, voices, barking dogs, the whir of walkie-talkies. Marianne stood, waving frantically, calling out until they found her. Rescue workers rushed down the slope, lifting the girl gently, wrapping her in blankets and carrying her toward the waiting ambulance. As they climbed back up the hill, Ash rose with effort, his limp more pronounced but his eyes bright, watching the girl until she disappeared from sight. "You found her, Ash," Sadie whispered, hugging the stallion's neck. "You saved her." Marianne wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by relief and pride. She knelt beside Sadie and Ash, pressing her hand to the horse's broad shoulder. "He knew where to stand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always does." They returned to the ranch as the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the fields. News spread quickly about the lost girl, the horse who found her, the family that refused to give up. Neighbors stopped by to offer thanks, their voices thick with gratitude and awe. But for Marianne and Sadie, the real miracle wasn't just that Ash had saved the girl. It was the way he'd taught them to trust, to hope, to follow, even when the trail seemed hidden by darkness and fear. That night, as the first stars pricked the sky, Ash stood beneath Sadie's window, silent as ever. But when Sadie pressed her palm to the glass, he lifted his head and nickered softly. A promise. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep moving forward, even when you don't know the way. Word about Ash spread through the valley as spring finally pushed back the remnants of winter. It started with the rescue, the story of the broken stallion with the iron leg who had found a lost girl when even seasoned trackers could not. People spoke of him in the feed store and at church suppers, sharing how Marianne's quiet ranch had become a place of unlikely miracles. The news drew curiosity, awe, and even a touch of skepticism from outsiders. But for those closest to the story, Ash was proof that sometimes healing didn't just come from people, but from the wounded themselves. For Sadie and Marianne, life found a new rhythm. There were still difficult days, nights when nightmares returned, mornings when Ash stood with his back to the world, lost in his own storms. But more often now, the air in the house was filled with laughter, the clink of breakfast dishes, the tap of Sadie's pencil as she scribbled stories at the kitchen table. Ash followed Sadie's footsteps from window to window, his black shadow moving with her, an anchor of calm and quiet strength. It wasn't long before others came seeking what Ash seemed to offer. Marianne received a phone call one chilly afternoon from a neighbor, a single mother whose young son, Caleb, struggled with a stutter so fierce he'd stopped speaking outside the house. Caleb was terrified of loud noises and bigger animals, horses most of all. But after hearing what Ash had done, his mother wondered aloud if Ash might be different, if there might be a chance for her son to find courage in the presence of a creature who knew something about fear. Marianne hesitated only for a moment. "Come tomorrow, if you like. There's no pressure. Just let Caleb meet him. If he wants to leave, we'll understand." The next afternoon, Caleb arrived, his mother holding his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. He was small for his age, pale and wide-eyed, clinging to his mother's side as they stepped from the car. Ash was grazing near the paddock, tail flicking, one ear cocked toward the visitors. Sadie met them at the fence, her smile shy but welcoming. "He's not scary," she promised quietly, crouching to Caleb's height. "He's just big on the outside. Inside, he's just soft." Caleb nodded, but stayed behind his mother. Marianne, watching from a few paces away, felt the familiar ache of wanting to fix something she could not touch. She motioned for Sadie to bring Ash closer. Sadie walked to Ash, whispered a few words into his ear, and pressed her palm to his neck. Ash flicked his ear again, turned, and lumbered slowly toward the fence. Caleb's eyes went wide, breath catching in his throat. He shrank back, burying his face in his mother's coat. Ash stopped a few feet from the fence, lowered his head, and closed his eyes. He stood motionless, his breathing slow and even. There was no snort, no stamping of hooves, only a deep, silent patience. Caleb peered out from behind his mother. "Why? Is he not moving?" he stammered. Sadie smiled gently. "He waits until you're ready. That's how he is with everyone." Minutes passed. The only sound was the wind in the grass and the distant call of a mourning dove. Caleb's mother knelt beside him, whispering encouragement. Finally, Caleb took a halting step forward, then another, until he stood just inside the paddock. His hand trembled as he reached out, not quite touching Ash, but close enough to feel the warmth of his breath. "Thank you for not yelling," Caleb whispered. Ash's ear flicked as if he understood. He lowered his head further, so that Caleb's outstretched fingers brushed the velvet of his muzzle. Caleb let out a breath, eyes shining, and for a long moment he and the horse simply stood together, silent and at ease. Marianne watched, her heart full. She glanced at Ash, understanding for the first time what Sadie had always seemed to know instinctively. Ash didn't just accept what he was given, he mirrored it, reflecting back calm, patience, and the kind of gentle acceptance that made even the most frightened soul feel seen. Word spread. Soon, others began to visit. a teenage girl, newly arrived in town, whose hands shook so badly from anxiety that she couldn't hold a brush, spent hours at the fence, watching Ash graze until, slowly, she was brave enough to stroke his mane. An older man, who had lost his wife, came every Thursday, sitting on a nearby bench, talking to Ash in a cracked, soft voice about the memories that haunted him. Every encounter was quiet. No one forced conversation. No one expected instant transformation. Ash was simply present, calm, accepting, never demanding. His very brokenness became a bridge, allowing others to see themselves in him, to trust that their own wounds might not make them unworthy of kindness. Sadie blossomed in this new season. She became the unofficial tour guide for Ash's visitors, sharing stories about his quirks, his love of apples, his knack for finding sun-warmed patches of grass, even in the coldest mornings. She listened to their stories, too, sometimes speaking, sometimes just offering a smile. Her laughter became familiar music on the ranch, drawing even the shyest guests out of their shells. Marianne, too, found herself changing. The heaviness she'd carried for so long lightened as she watched the quiet miracles unfold. She learned to trust Ash's instincts, how he would draw close to someone trembling with fear, or step away when someone needed space. She saw how he would stand with Sadie during her nightmares, or nuzzle her gently when grief threatened to pull her under. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange behind the mountains, Marianne sat beside Sadie on the porch, both watching Ash as he stood at the far end of the paddock, his silhouette strong and still against the fading light. "He's not just our horse anymore," Sadie said softly. "He belongs to everyone now. Everyone who needs him." Marianne nodded, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "He gives back what he's given. That's all any of us can do." In that golden hour, the world felt wide with possibility. The scars of loss were still there, but they were softened by the gentle touch of a stallion, who had learned, at last, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand quietly beside someone else, offering nothing more and nothing less than the comfort of presence. It was the first warm day of true spring when Marianne taped the flyer to the bulletin board at the grocery store. Adoption event, Whispering Pines Rescue Ranch. Come meet our animals, share their stories, and maybe bring one home. The idea came from Ruth, the old ranch manager, who called and insisted that Ash, the miracle horse, be part of the event, even if no one dared adopt him. "People need to see what hope looks like," Ruth said. "They need to see you and Sadie, too." The weeks leading up to the adoption event were busy and anxious. Marianne and Sadie washed and brushed Ash until his black coat gleamed, even as the prosthetic leg stayed battered and dull, a badge of battles fought and survived. They cleaned the little barn, painted new signs for each animal, and made a banner to hang above the paddock gate. Second chances. For Sadie, who'd once barely spoken, the thought of talking to a crowd made her palms sweat and her voice wobble. But every night, Ash waited by her window, his patient presence a reminder that sometimes courage was simply standing where you were needed. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear. Cars and pickup trucks filled the gravel lot. Neighbors brought folding chairs and boxes of cookies. Children ran through the grass, laughter ringing in the air. For the first time in years, the ranch buzzed with energy, the emptiness replaced by possibility. Other animals were brought out first, the brown and white goat who chewed through every leash, a pair of shy barn cats, a plump pony with one cloudy eye. People petted them, snapped photos, and signed up for information. Marianne watched it all with nervous pride, waving to Ruth across the paddock. When it was time for Ash, Marianne felt her heart jump. She led him from his stall, Sadie walking beside them, one hand resting steady on his mane. Ash's prosthetic clicked softly on the packed dirt, drawing eyes and whispers. Some people stepped back, old memories of wild kicks and angry warnings lingering in their faces. But most just watched, their expressions shifting from curiosity to wonder as Ash walked with calm purpose, head high, eyes bright. They stopped in the center of the ring. Marianne handed the microphone to Sadie, her hand trembling a little. Sadie took a breath, the crowd falling silent. She glanced at Ash, who flicked his ear in her direction, then back at the waiting faces. "My name is Sadie," she began, her voice steady but small. "This is Ash. When he came here, everyone called him broken. They said he was too hurt, too wild to be part of a family. But Ash isn't just a horse. He's a friend. He carried my fears until I could walk on my own again. He showed me it's okay to be scared, that you don't have to heal all at once. You just have to keep going." The crowd listened, some with tears shining in their eyes. A woman in a blue scarf sniffled. A teenage boy shifted on his feet, hiding a smile. The silence that followed was full, not with judgment, but with respect. When Sadie finished, Ash turned his head and nuzzled her gently, and as if to say, "That's enough. I've got you." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Sadie blushed, but her smile shone. People came forward with questions about his leg, about how he learned to trust, about whether he would ever be normal. Marianne answered honestly, "He'll always be himself. That's more than enough." Then, quietly, a man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He wore a faded army jacket, his left hand shaking as he fumbled with a pair of old dog tags around his neck. The lines in his face were deep, his eyes haunted but kind. Marianne recognized him, a war veteran who'd moved to town a few years back, always quiet at the post office, always alone. He hesitated at the edge of the paddock, looking not at the people, but at Ash. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, the broken soldier and the wounded stallion. Sadie saw him and smiled, giving him silent permission to approach. The man took a careful step forward, boots scuffing the earth. Ash watched him, his body still, every muscle alert. But as the man reached out, his hand trembling, Ash did not flinch. He lowered his head, letting the man stroke his muzzle, the touch tentative and reverent. "Thank you," the man whispered, so quietly only Sadie and Marianne heard, "for not turning away." Ash closed his eyes, content. Others followed. Children, hesitant at first, came closer, giggling as Ash nosed at their pockets for treats. An elderly woman in a wheelchair reached out, and Ash leaned down, gentle as falling snow. One by one, those who felt left behind by grief, by war, by their own secret sorrows, found a place by his side, if only for a moment. The event was a success. Several animals found new homes, and the ranch raised enough money to keep their doors open another season. But more than that, something subtle but powerful had changed. Marianne saw it in the way her neighbors lingered, talking softly to one another, sharing stories of loss and healing and hope. When the sun slipped behind the hills and the crowd began to thin, Marianne hugged Sadie tight. "You were brave today," she said, her voice thick. Sadie shook her head, smiling up at Ash. "He was brave first. I just followed." As twilight deepened, Ash stood tall beneath the banner, the soft click of his prosthetic mingling with the laughter and farewells. He was no longer just the dangerous horse or the problem case. He was a survivor, a symbol, a friend. For Sadie, Marianne, and everyone who had gathered, he was a reminder that second chances could change everything, even when scars remained. That night, as the last cars pulled away and the stars came out, Ash remained in the paddock, watching over the empty fields. His shadow stretched long in the moonlight, strong and peaceful, marking a circle that now held not just him, but everyone he'd come to know, and everyone who had found a piece of themselves in his quiet strength. Dawn broke gentle and golden over whispering pines, the air sweet with the promise of summer, and the hills alight with wildflowers blooming where snow once clung. The world outside was waking up, but on the ranch, an unusual stillness lingered. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting sorrow, but from having survived it together. Ash stood in the open field, morning light painting his black coat in ripples of bronze. The prosthetic leg, worn but steady, pressed against dewy grass as he shifted his weight, eyes scanning the horizon. Sadie was there too, a small figure curled on a blanket, having fallen asleep in the soft grass after a long night beneath the stars. Close by, Marianne sat on the porch steps, journal in hand, mug of coffee cooling beside her, heart heavy and full, all at once. There was no more to prove. There was only what had been given and what had been found. As the ranch came to life, birds chattering, a rooster crowing, the wind stirring the pines, Marianne wrote, the words flowing in a way they hadn't in years. Grief made us quiet. But Ash stood where we couldn't. Not because we were weak, because he knew where to stand. Some wounds never fully heal, but when someone else is willing to stand with you, they stop hurting so loud. She paused, pen hovering, watching as Sadie rolled over, hair tangled, face serene in sleep. Ash watched her too, unmoving, the quiet guardian she never had to ask for. Marianne remembered how impossible that had seemed, how a horse so broken by cruelty and fear could become the heart of a family. The gentle giant who mended what nothing else could. She thought of the lost girl, safe because Ash had trusted his instincts. She remembered the old veteran at the adoption event, hand shaking as he stroked Ash's muzzle, tears in his eyes as he found comfort in the acceptance of a creature who asked for nothing. She remembered Caleb, the stuttering boy who found words in Ash's silence, and the countless others who had come to the ranch hoping to find themselves reflected in the eyes of a horse who had lost so much, yet still chose to stand. It struck Marianne that Ash had never tried to hide his scars. He'd never shied away from what he'd lost, never pretended to be whole when he wasn't. He simply showed up every day, exactly as he was, and somehow, by refusing to turn away from pain, his own or anyone else's, he taught those around him to do the same. The lesson was simple, but it was everything. Sadie woke with a soft sigh, sitting up and stretching, her hand immediately reaching out to brush Ash's mane. He nickered, lowering his head so she could press her forehead to his. For a long moment they stayed like that, child and stallion, survivors both, bound by a quiet understanding that words could never explain. Later that day, as Marianne and Sadie walked the fence line together, they talked about what would come next. Summer brought new visitors to the ranch, families hoping to meet Ash, children asking about his leg, about his courage, about what it meant to begin again. Well, Sadie answered every question with patience, sometimes even laughter, as Ash followed her at a respectful distance, grazing in the tall grass, always close enough to watch. The ranch felt different now, not just a place of rescue, but a place of belonging. Marianne noticed it in the way neighbors lingered after dropping off hay, in the laughter shared over the fence, in the gentle hush that fell whenever Ash approached. People left with more than they came for: hope, comfort, a sense that maybe their scars were not shameful, but simply proof of the battles they'd survived. That evening, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Sadie and Marianne sat together on the porch steps. The day was nearly done. Ash stood out in the field, the last rays of sunlight glinting off his mane. Sadie leaned against her mother, her voice small but strong. "Do you think he'll ever forget the things that hurt him?" she asked. Marianne wrapped an arm around her, thinking of all the ways they'd tried and failed to erase their own hurts. "No, honey, but I think he's found something bigger than pain to carry now. He found us. And we found him." Sadie smiled, tracing circles in the dust with her toe. "Maybe we're all just looking for a place to stand, like Ash." Marianne squeezed her hand, feeling the truth settle in her chest, quiet, strong, and steady. As night fell, and the ranch lights blinked on one by one, Marianne found herself returning to the words she'd written that morning, adding a final thought to her journal. Some wounds never fully heal, but with the right presence, they stop hurting so loud. And with that, the story, Ash's story, Sadie's, Marianne's, and all who had been touched by the stallion with a shadowed gait, came full circle. Not with a perfect ending, but with a promise to stand with one another, to accept scars without shame, to answer pain with presence. If this story touched something quiet in you, don't let it stay quiet. Share it, Somewhere out there, someone's still waiting for their ash. Sometimes healing starts with the courage to stand where you are, scars and all. Maybe you're the presence that helps someone else's hurt not feel so loud. The stars came out, one by one, and in the deep hush that followed, Ash lifted his head, ears flicking at the sound of Sadie's laughter. In the place where silence had once ruled, there was now a chorus of quiet voices, of hope, of survival, and of the promise that no one has to stand alone.